Today, I want to give you an introduction to the BBC. The BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, is a very useful tool for learning about the UK culture and for learning English and improving your fluency and pronunciation. I'm going to start by looking at BBC Radio, which is a better resource than the television. BBC Radio is a huge organization in itself. There are four main radio channels, and we're going to look at those as the principal part of this video. And I can explain how they can help you and what you should be listening out for. Okay, so BBC Radio 1 is traditionally the radio of young people. I think that's changed a little bit as young people have moved away from listening to the radio and now listen to music through other channels. But BBC Radio 1 is definitely the youngest part of the BBC radio panoply. It always used to be famous for having the pop charts, which was the top of the pops. That was the charts that came out every week. That was on a Sunday night. Those are certainly less important than they used to be. It was also famous for what is called the breakfast program. Now, the breakfast program is something that you might want to look into because it gives you a really good idea of the sense of humor of ordinary British people and young people. It's not especially bothered with the news or anything like that. The news segments fly in very quickly and fly out. There's never any serious discussion. But the breakfast program definitely has things like prank phone calls, light-hearted commentary on current affairs, and obviously music that is current, music that is being put out today. That is quite different from Radio 2. Now, Radio 2 is also a good resource for learning about British culture. The reason I say it's a good resource, even though it's what we call middle of the road music, that means music that comes from maybe the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and nothing particularly hard or difficult. So they're not going to play heavy rock or punk music or anything like that. It's generally things like, say, endless rehashing of the Beatles, pop singers like Barbra Streisand. And it's difficult for me because I don't really know the names of these singers anyway. Queen would be on there quite a lot. Now, if you want to understand the different demographics in England, listening to Radio 1 and Radio 2 together will definitely enable you to understand that generation of people that got older, the generation just after the boomers, as they're called, people who got old with this music in their past, and they have a different sense of humor to the Radio 1 audience. Their sense of humor is much more gentle, if you like. It's not raucous. They don't have so much of the many people in the studio laughing in like hyenas at the same joke. So there's less in-joking. In fact, you might say it even follows the model of Radio 1 back in the 1970s. Again, just like Radio 1, it'll have a breakfast show and then night shows and whatever. They're called shows, which is paradoxical because it's radio. They're not showing anything. But you have these programs that are called After the Presenter, and they're called the Tony Bennett Show or something like that. Even if you don't like the kind of music, it's a very good way of understanding British culture. They direct themselves at something that they themselves call the great British public. Now, whether you like this term or not, the idea is that people have the same aspirations and ideas and they come together around them. So, as someone trying to understand British culture, it's a good idea to understand what the great British public might be. Now, Radio 3 is something different entirely. Radio 3 is what you might call higher end culture. That means it's classical music, jazz, opera, and a little bit of world music thrown in with more highbrow plays and theatre. There are some commentary shows. You definitely notice when you listen to Radio 3 that people speak more slowly, they have more cultured accents. It would be a mistake to think of Radio 3 as posh, as the level of culture generally in the country is sufficient for quite ordinary people like me to listen to Radio 3 in preference to Radio 1 and 2. So it's not particularly posh, but it certainly has a higher cultural level. Radio 3 sometimes, because it's BBC and they like to push things and be inventive, sometimes they resist the temptation to go back over the same old classics again and again and again, and they try to push out something a little bit newer. So Radio 3 has seen its market, if you like, or its audience heavily influenced by the arrival of another channel which is independent called Classic FM. Now, Classic FM is precisely that. It's endlessly repeating the same classical music. So it's the kind of music that you find on the favorites of, some combined collection of classical favorites and whatever. So people who just want something smooth and mellow and who listen to classical music more as kind of wallpaper rather than serious music tend to prefer Classic FM these days. It models itself on what Radio 2 used to be and Radio 1. So it even has a chart of classical music, which is a ridiculous concept, but there it is. Some ex-Radio 1 and Radio 2 DJs made the move to Classic FM. Now, obviously, if you're interested in British culture, it's not the music that interests you, but you might be interested in the kind of culture and music that everyday British people are listening to. I think it might be of interest to you to discover that and to see the differences between Radio 3 and Classic FM. Now, you can't define people entirely because there's nobody who holds their hands up and says, I am Classic FM. All are components of different parts of the cultures. They're all there. That kind of all in it together kind of thing, which I think in the BBC they have this idea of the great British public, is much more evident in Radio 4. Now, Radio 4 is talk radio. I grew up with Radio 4. I think, you could say I matured with Radio 4 in the UK. So I started to listen to Radio 4 when I was still at high school or secondary school, and continued to listen to it when I was a student. And it was only in my mid-20s that I got annoyed with the idea of the great British public and stopped listening to it. But I'd still dip into Radio 4 if I were visiting the UK. So here are some things that you could look out for on Radio 4. Now, obviously, Radio 4 is talk radio, and it deals with all aspects of British culture. It's this idea the Broadcasting Corporation has, that it is broadcasting to the whole population of the UK. So I'm just going to give you some idea of what a Radio 4 day looks like. So it starts out in the morning with the Today program, which is the news program that most serious-minded people would listen to in the car on their way to work. It starts at around about 6:30, I think, in the morning. I seem to remember, and it's a mixture of news reporting and interviews. Famously, it's a place where politicians go to the Today program when there is an issue in the public mind. There are also news programs later in the day. I think there's one called PM, for example. But the Today program is really the flagship news program. So if you're looking on the web page and you want to see the BBC attitude to something in the international current affairs, I think go to the Radio 4 webpage and look at the Today program and see what you find there. But that's not the news is not the only thing that they have on Radio 4. There's a range of products that they put out. So they have, for example, magazine programs, and magazine programs are where presenters do interviews and discuss issues within particular areas. So one famous magazine programs on Radio 4 are, for example, Woman's Hour, which is not just for women, but historically dealt with women's issues. It's a long-running early afternoon women's program. And then there are specific interest magazine programs like Gardener's Question Time, where a panel of experts respond to questions from the public. There are cultural programs such as In Our Time, where academics come and discuss historical and cultural ideas. And then there are more specific interest things such as Money Box, which, I mean, I don't even know if some of these programs are still running. As I said, I haven't listened to Radio 4 much recently, but it's a good place for you to investigate. The other thing that you'll find interesting about Radio 4 perhaps is the entertainment programs. And if you are listening and you have an interest in sort of fast-running entertainment, some of it is dramatic and some of it is just an equivalent of a kind of panel show. And there are long-running formats for that. So there's things such as the news quiz, which is satirical, and then there are light-hearted kind of parlor games like Just a Minute. So I highly recommend investigating BBC Radio. Don't go just to BBC Radio Learn English, which has its own website. The content there is excellent. But if you want to learn about British culture, go to the BBC Radio webpage. From there, you can navigate to BBC Radio 1, BBC Radio 2, BBC Radio 3, and BBC Radio 4. There is no problem in accessing those from Spain. Okay, that's my post for today. I will come back again tomorrow with something new.